armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC, weapons wielded in combat, uniforms and helmets, medals of honor. They tell the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. These relics of war are known as Militaria. Today on Militaria, our museum team investigates items used to raise the spirits of Canadian troops in both World Wars.
And they have seen a lot of history that makes these bagpipes very, very valuable indeed.
And a mysterious Bible rescued from a torpedoed ship.
He'd gone on to check for survivors. He found this Bible and tucked it in his boot and brought it back.
Ken Hines checks out a dagger once wielded by one of Hitler's brutal Nazi stormtroopers.
The motto, Alles für Deutschland, or All for Germany, is very clear and stamped well into the metal of the blade.
Kevin Robbins examines a German machine gun captured by Canadian soldiers near the end of the First World War.
They used this not only in a defensive posture, but the Germans used machine guns as an offensive weapon as well.
And a guest arrives with a sword connected to the Battle of Culloden and Scottish migration to Nova Scotia.
The sword could date from anywhere from like 1690 to 1740.
Oh wow. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay,
so this is an old sword.
Gary Siliker, I'm originally from the Miramichi, and I live in Mahone Bay now. I was in the military I had 31 years regular and 13 reserve. I brought in a German mess tin that was picked up on the 28th of September at Borlaug Wood. It's been converted as trench art.
This beautiful work of art was once a German soldier's mess tin. Who created it remains a mystery, but the tin, now cared for by the Mahone Bay Legion, offers a few clues. Perhaps one of two Nova Scotian brothers named on the tin painstakingly scratched pictures and words depicting Canada's role in breaking through Germany's heavily fortified positions along the Western Front, the so-called Hindenburg Line. General Arthur Currie's audacious plan had Canadian engineers, under fire, install portable bridges across a dry section of Canal du Nord. Once across, the Canadians would fight the Germans among the barbed wire and machine gun nests hidden in Bourlon Wood, before skirmishing in the streets of Bourlon and Cambrai. Currie's plan succeeded at the cost of 20,000 Canadian lives.
We're here at the Army Museum with Mr. Gary Siliker, a Canadian Army veteran. Gary has kindly brought in a M1910 German mess tin, standard sort of issue to the German Imperial Army throughout the war. This, I believe, is a late war version. It's made out of aluminum. So you've done a fair bit of research on this already, Gary. So I was wondering what you could tell us maybe about the two brothers.
It says it was picked up at Borlaug Wood on the 28th of September, so the second day of the Battle of Canal du Nord. And the two brothers, John and Ralph Russell from Digby, Nova Scotia. John was the older brother. He was a sapper surveyor by trade on Civilian Street, and Ralph was in the 25th Battalion. It was picked up on the 28th of September, so that's the second day of the battle. John would have been there. He had been wounded the summer before at Hill 70. He had come back into the line in July of 1918, and his brother Ralph had been wounded at the Battle of Amiens in August of 18. He got back in basically the day the war ended, so they would have met in that area. How it ended up in Digby County, I have no idea. I've tried to find out, nobody can tell me.
This is really kind of a one-of-a-kind on this side of the water as far as I know. I've seen a lot of trench art over the years. There's those that have seen more, but I've never seen a piece done like this. Some, what they call trench art, is made by soldiers. Say an armorer might have like a lathe. It could be somebody in the field who has a bit of time and access to tools, and they could be making something. Other trench art can be stuff that's made by soldiers that are convalescing, so almost like a way of therapy, of getting people to use their hands again, you know, getting use back in digits. And most of the trench art you'll see is made out of shell fragments or shell casings. So the piece that Gary has brought in is quite exceptional in that it's made out of a mess tin. So up top here, we've got this almost Celtic style scroll work that's here. So you can see it's all back here. We have the area again where it was picked up at the Bourlon Wood during the Battle of the 100 Days. And then down below here, this amazing bit of sort of engraving here. Canadian soldiers in a forward position moving up. There's an 18-pounder field gun here. We've got a sky burst just over that gun crew. And as we move around the back, there are their names. They're the two brothers' names here. And again, their units. And I have a feeling, given how this is all here, it's like a little memorial or memory piece. I have a feeling maybe there was a picture of the two brothers at some point.
A picture of the two of them? Why not? Eh?
Yeah, again, their names are here, so it'd be kind of like a little thing on the mantle or somewhere on a bookshelf, a ode to their time overseas. What's really extraordinary too is that, again, this would have been covered with a black enamel, but they've left some of the enamel finish on here to give it like a certain perspective within the artwork. So here is like something that you would see at night against the black is an air barrage or an artillery barrage balloon here. And then over on the side here, we have two aircraft in a dogfight. One of these fellows is rapidly coming to Earth. And they're using that almost as a relief against extra artwork.
Very clever.
Oh, it's very clever, yeah. Somebody had like a really nice sense of artistry here and a very steady hand.
And time.
And time, yeah. You have a lot of downtime in those trenches, a lot of downtime. As you've probably heard that expression that hell is long periods of boredom intermixed with short periods of absolute terror. My grandfather used to say you could be out of the line for 10 days. He said you're back in the trenches for an hour and you can feel the fleas and lice all over you already. So you're hungry a lot of the time, you're cold, you're wet most of the time, you're constantly shelled and shot at. There's snipers all the time. It's very much like an apocalyptic sort of atmosphere, right? It's an unnatural place. It's an awful experience to be in the trenches. Well, Gary, this is a point in the program and with these interviews where we sometimes ask individuals if they'd like to donate the artifact to the museum. This is the property of the Mahone Bay Legion, so we won't do that. And I'd just like to say on behalf of the Army Museum, and no doubt many of the people that are watching, I'd like to thank you for your years of service to the country here at home and overseas. So thank you so much for coming, and thanks for everything. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One of the brothers picked that up and held on to it. And they thought, you know, it'd be a nice little home memorial. There's a direct connection to the artisan that made that.
It'll go back in the display case, and I'll talk to them saying, look guys, you know, if the museum would like to have it, would you be willing to consider sending it down that way? Because it'd be nice to, get down here and be seen by a lot more people, eh?
My name's Brad Smith, and I'm from Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Spent 20 years in the Army and 2 years in the reserves. Brought in a teapot that my grandfather made. He was on the Niobe on the day of the explosion, the Halifax explosion.
This teapot's origins are steeped in history. It's made from debris of the Halifax explosion. But not just any debris. Brad Smith's grandfather, John Haas, built it from fragments of HMCS Niobe, the Canadian Navy's first ship on the Atlantic coast. Haas worked as a stoker, shoveling coal into the ship's boilers. The Niobe was serving as a floating barracks for sailors when the explosion devastated Halifax. Her upper decks were badly damaged, but her lower decks survived, including the workshop where Haas fashioned this teapot. The Niobe was scrapped a few years later, but this one-of-a-kind teapot steams on.
Well, Brad, welcome to the Army Museum. Your grandfather had a fascinating record of service during the First World War. Can you tell us more about that?
When he first went to enlist, he actually enlisted in the infantry, but he was a little young at the time. And when his mother found out, she went down to the depot where he was and basically got him out of the Army, saying that he was too young, and took him back home to the farm.
But he didn't take no for an answer, I guess.
No, a few months later, he joined the Navy and served with them through the rest of the war, getting out in 1919.
I can only imagine how, annoyed your great-grandmother must have been when he tried to join the Army without getting a permission.
And how embarrassed he was when she showed up.
Oh, yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what you brought?
Brought a teapot that my grandfather made from the ship that he was on in World War I, the Niobe. I also brought some photographs and some paperwork from his military career as well.
Well, that's fantastic. I'll start with a little bit of the story of HMCS Niobe. She was the very first ship of the Royal Canadian Navy, acquired in 1910. At the outbreak of the war, she was at sea doing convoy escort work and a number of other jobs. But by 1915, she required so many repairs that they tied her up here in Halifax as an accommodations ship. On the morning of the 6th of December 1917, she was tied up alongside here in Halifax when the explosion happened. And apparently your grandfather handmade that teapot from fragments of the Niobe that he picked up after the Halifax explosion.
He told me that he had gotten the parts and designed and built the teapot himself.
Well, it's a pretty fascinating artifact, particularly when one considers there are very few artifacts like it of the Niobe that exist in our country. But this handmade teapot by a member of the crew of HMCS Niobe is a pretty unique item indeed. So Brad, let's take a closer look at this unique, magnificent teapot that your grandfather made. It's obviously made from a mixture of materials, the main part made from copper, and all of the fittings are made, it appears to be from brass, and the wood itself likely from the teak decking fragments that he may have found after the explosion.
Yeah, he was also a stoker down in the engine room. Down in that area, they also had basically a workshop. He actually did this after the explosion while he was still on the ship itself.
Wow.
Just down on the base of it, you can see forever inscribed on both leaves, to never forget the sacrifice of the sailors and soldiers. We should never forget what they did for their country.
Do you think it was ever used to make tea?
I'm going to say that it had to be used at least once.
Right.
He was the type of man that he would have tried it out.
For sure. Yeah, at least.
Just to make sure it worked.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that in today. It's a really magnificent piece of what we would call in the Army trench art, but it was a different kind of trench art. It was a sea war art made from the fragments of the Niobe after the explosion by your grandfather by hand. I've never seen anything like it.
You've got the people on the tops of the decks of the ships that everybody looks at, but below the decks there were the stokers, the machinists, the hull techs that keep the ships running. And a lot of times there are stories that don't get told.
Well, it's a fascinating story, family history, and a wonderful artifact of your grandfather's service. This teapot is a very rare artifact, directly connected not only to your family, but also to the beginnings of the Royal Canadian Navy. It's been in your family for over a century, handmade by your grandfather and then handed down from generation to generation. And for that reason, it's a wonderful thing to have it here today. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in and show it to us.
Thank you very much.
My name is Brad Brown, originally from Ottawa, Ontario. I've been living in Nova Scotia since about 1992. I've long had an interest in Militaria. The machine gun was actually offered, and I contacted the seller and said, yes, I'm interested. It's in relic condition, but I'm very interested, particularly where there is history that can be researched on the gun.
Canadian soldiers captured this German machine gun in a fierce battle near the end of World War I. Its current owner, Brad Brown, would like to know more about what those brave young men did that day. Machine guns were a terrifying new addition to the battlefields of Europe. When British troops first encountered them at France's Somme River, they were completely unprepared. German machine gunners mowed them down, and by nightfall, 20,000 lay dead. The savage killing power of the German guns sparked an arms race. Allied nations rushed to produce their own automatic weapons, spitting out hundreds of bullets per minute. Machine guns like this one made it easy to slaughter masses of soldiers at a distance, and forever changed how wars are fought.
We're here at the Army Museum with Brad Brown. Brad has generously brought in a relic from the First World War. Would you like to tell us something about this piece, Brad?
Absolutely, Kevin. This is a World War I German MG08-15 machine gun. This gun in particular was actually captured on the 2nd of September 1918 by Canadian soldiers during the last 100 days of the war. After the war, they took guns like this, brought them back to Canada in about 1922. And from there, it has transitioned through several sets of hands into my ownership.
The amount of research he's done, being able to figure out where it came from, finding the trench maps that went with it, that's what really brings it to life and gives it even a stronger connection to history and the events of that time period. The Battle of the 100 Days begins on the 8th of August and concludes on November 11th with the signing of the armistice and the surrender of the German Imperial Army. So this will be the final chapter of the First World War. When they call it the Battle of the 100 Days, it's that. It's 100 days of constant combat. So when the 100 Days battle is planned, the Canadian Army is handpicked by Allied High Command to lead the offensive. There is no other body of troops on the Western Front that the German Imperial Army hate more and fear more for their use of the bayonet, their unrelenting trench raids. On August 8th, the Canadian Army moves 20 kilometers inside German lines. It will fight literally right up until 11 o'clock on November 11th. Brad, you're already, I'm sure, aware of this. This is one of over 150,000 of this model weapon that was produced for the German Imperial Army. They use this not only in a defensive posture, but the Germans used machine guns as an offensive weapon as well. So to capture 80 of these in one day shows the rapid advance of the Canadian Army during the 100 days. Okay, when we look at the architecture of this weapon, the shoulder stock makes this more portable from the 08 original that we'll see eventually. A significant aspect of the difference of this weapon is the reduction of the firing mechanism in this breech block. This weighing in at 33 pounds, not what you'd call a light machine gun. There's many photographs that show the sort of deployment of these in gun pits with young German soldiers. Prior to the First World War, it was considered perfectly all right to use automatic weapons against non-Europeans in India, in Africa, other places where European nations had imperial interests. So when the German Imperial Army go to war, they have 20 machine guns for every infantry battalion. By contrast, the British Army will have 2. So when they start bringing these weapons to such terrible effect against other Europeans, this is considered this horrendous war crime, because to use such a weapon against another European is, this is just not done. It's beyond the pale. Now we've looked at the architecture of this weapon. We can go next door now and look at the Maxim 1908 pattern machine gun that this has evolved from. Here we are with the 1908 pattern Maxim machine gun. And this gun as well has been part of the museum's collection since 1953. And when we look at this in comparison to the 15, we can see the elongated firing breech mechanism here that's been greatly reduced. You still have a water coolant system that surrounds the barrel. And again, this weapon, like the other, 600 rounds a minute, 1,000-yard range.
And it would use, from what I was told, about a half a liter of water for every belt of ammunition. You had a big team of soldiers who were bringing not just bullets, but also cases of water.
Yep. When I think of the machine gun corps at Vimy, when the Canadian Corps is coming down the backside of the ridge, looking over the Douai Plain, and they're putting their guns in, firing them on the Germans as they retreat. That's one of its stellar examples of the coordination of firepower and their ability to use those weapons so effectively.
It's important for today's soldiers to know what their forebears did. It brings to them a view of the courage, integrity, and the importance of the history of their units and where they came from and where they're taking our Canadian forces today.
Well, Brad, we'd really like to thank you on behalf of the museum for bringing this in and sharing the story of how you acquired this, restored it, the research you've done. This aspect of grassroots, everyman historian is the thing that'll keep the story of Canada's Expeditionary Force in the First World War alive. We have 2 examples of this in the museum's collection, so you're safe. You're going to be able to get this home without us trying to hit you up for it as part of a donation. So we really would like to thank you for bringing it in.
Thank you for the opportunity to bring it in and to learn a little bit more about the operational use of it. And this piece right here is a piece of our nation's history that for many years was lost, and now we're able to see it again so that people of today can see what our soldiers faced over a century ago.
Well, it's good of you to do that.
My name is Brian Carey. I was born and raised in Ottawa, Canada. Joined the reserves first 1996, Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa Infantry Regiment, Light Infantry. Served them for 6 years, and then I transitioned in 2005 to the regular force and rebadged to signals. So I was an Army signaler from that point, tactical radio operator, strictly speaking. I deployed to Afghanistan in that capacity as a Master Corporal. Served for 7 months there. I have a dagger from the Sturmabteilung, which was the Nazis' first security force before they expanded and had the SS and the entire German army behind them.
This Sturmabteilung dagger came into Brian Carey's possession through his family, from a relative who served as an ambulance driver in Europe during the Second World War. Before that, less is known, other than this blade would have been hung from the hip of one of Hitler's most fervent foot soldiers. These were the ceremonial weapons of the so-called brown shirts, German civilians who fought and killed Hitler's enemies in the streets of Germany and paved the way for his rise to power. From blocking the doors of Jewish businesses to bloody clashes with the political opponents of the Nazi Party, the sight of the brown shirts, with a dagger on their side, spread terror, first across Germany, then around the world.
I see you've brought in a pretty good example of an early 1930s Sturmabteilung or SA ceremonial dagger. These are quite rare in North America, and this is a pretty fine example of one, a ceremonial dagger that would have been worn with full dress uniform. It was never used in action per se.
So this is not a combat weapon, this is
No,
decorative?
it is definitely not a combat weapon, but it's a ceremonial weapon that one would wear on a parade or so on. How did you come across it, and what can you tell me about it?
It was brought back by a family member who was an ambulance driver in the Second World War, served in Holland and Germany. The SA I'm not very familiar with. I know that they were related to the Nazi Party, but if you could fill in some blanks.
Sure. I mean, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, as they were called, basically came out of service in the First World War, and the whole purpose was to serve Germany at that time and to undertake whatever tasks the state asked of them. And in many cases, they were pretty odious tasks during the Nazi era. But from 1919 until 1945, the SA was in existence in various forms. There were almost 3 million members of that odious organization that existed at that time.
I knew it was something special, given that it was Sturmabteilung, which predates the Second World War and the SS. I don't know a great deal about the history of the piece itself, so I'm pretty anxious to learn a bit more.
The example that you've brought is in very good condition given its age. The original nickel fittings are in very good condition, and the fit between the dagger itself and the scabbard is excellent. The German eagle and swastika is well inlaid into the handle. On the blade, you see what's called graying, but it's just an indication of its age. The motto, Alles für Deutschland, or All for Germany, is very clear and stamped well into the metal of the blade. Oftentimes when these things are polished over the years, people try to get the graying out, and as a result of that, they make indentations with the buffing mechanism into the motto and actually damages the cross-graining on the blade.
I was wondering, can you attach some sort of specific age to the piece?
I can get close to it, Brian. The early daggers had individual maker's marks on them, along with a stamp for the Gau, or the province in which the blade was made. It is probably one of the earlier ones.
So it's seen a lot.
It has, definitely.
Very interesting. I'm really glad I brought it in. I learned quite a bit more than I would not have been able to find out on my own. So yeah, it's been a really positive experience.
I mean, obviously an SA dagger conjures up some pretty negative thoughts and feelings amongst most of us, but it is a relic of war. It's always valuable and always useful for us to take the time to listen to those stories and to feature those artifacts here in the Army Museum. Here at the Army Museum, we do have quite an extensive collection of German and Nazi weaponry and insignia, and the reason we have it is because we need to remind people of that dark, odious, and dangerous time in the world. I think the most important thing to take away from this, your relative really was proud of his service and proud of what he did to free the world in conjunction with his comrades. It was a dark time, and the world survived. Well, Brian, thank you so much for bringing in this SA dagger. We dearly love to have it as part of the museum's collection, because the one that we have is not nearly in as good a condition as this one is. But I know that your relative service is important to you and you'd like to take it home with you, and I certainly advise all of the folks that bring things into the Army Museum to look after them as part of their family's history. And I hope that you'll look on this as an example of his service during a dark and dangerous time in our history.
Thanks very much for your input on it, and I will do exactly that.
All soldiers, regardless of where they came from, are real people with real hopes and dreams and aspirations, and in Canada's case, tens of thousands of them never got to live out those dreams. And so it's important for us today to remember that sacrifice and that service, because the human cost of armed conflict is very high. And that's what we try to do here, is to bring that human element into the story. And it's a human story as much as it is a story of conflict.
I'm Curtis Lord. I live in Bedford, Nova Scotia. The sword belongs right now to the senior members of my mother's side of the family. My mother told me the story that it was used in the Battle of Culloden. I just think it's an interesting item to have.
This rare sword is believed to have drawn blood in the legendary Battle of Culloden. For Curtis Lord's family, the sword is a priceless connection to their ancestors. It's also a direct link to a dark day in Scottish history and to Scottish settlement in Nova Scotia. Highland Scots got caught up in a war over the British throne, known as the Jacobite Rising. The rising ended when the British Army routed the Highlanders at Culloden. The British took revenge against the Scots through a campaign known as the Highland Clearances, led by Edward Cornwallis, who later became the controversial founder of Halifax. British soldiers murdered and raped Highlanders, burned their homes and destroyed their crops. Thousands of Scots fled to the New World. Many, like Curtis Lord's ancestors, settled in Nova Scotia.
So, Curtis, this is quite a sword you've brought us. Your family has a connection in the legend that was used at the Battle of Culloden. I hate to be the one to tell you, but this is not a Highland basket-hilted broadsword.
Okay.
By the length, the size, and the architecture of this sword is a horseman's sword.
Okay.
This is the thing that first kind of put me onto this, was the suspension rings. Okay. These are normally only seen on cavalry swords of this period. The other aspect is, again, the style of ribbon paneling that's here on the hilt. And you can see the interior, how big the interior of this is. This is to accommodate somebody who's wearing a big leather cavalry gauntlet. Your finger goes in that ring, and then when you draw that out, you've got like a blade that's that long, which makes for an excellent cavalry sword. Okay. And so this initially, before it was broken, would have had like a spear point tip, so you could use it for thrusting as well. But we can see here that someone at some point has tried to mend this. That's almost like someone has done a dovetail in the blade, but again, the second half is missing. Even if this sword had been packed together, you'd never really be able to use it because it would have lost its overall strength. This sword could date from anywhere from like 1690 to 1740.
Oh wow, okay.
Oh yeah,
Okay,
this is an old sword. The legend of the family is that it's Culloden. It's of the time period. It's certainly of that time period. And again, this is very much in keeping with this German, or what they sometimes call Walloon style sword. These things all kind of point more to a German or continental sort of manufacture and provenience.
So it's of the era, but not necessarily Scottish by manufacture.
By manufacture, no.
Okay. I think the biggest surprise was that it's not a Scottish sword, in that it was probably made in Germany, but because it's of the era, there's possibly an alignment there. So it's nice to know that it's of that time period, and it's nice to have an expert's perspective.
So Curtis, are you familiar with the story of the Battle of Culloden?
You know, I know only a little bit. I know it was, you know, the Jacobite Rebellion versus the British. After the battle, the Scottish were forced to give up a lot of their Highland culture and surrender their arms.
Yeah, the Battle of Culloden was April 16th, 1746. The Jacobite army, they'd done a 20-mile march. The whole battle, from the time the charge is given to the time the Jacobites withdraw with heavy losses, it's like 1 hour. The British will lose about 300 men. The Scots Highlanders will lose anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000. You lose like a real generation of people. The British Crown implements what they call proscription laws. It's like an apartheid system.
Okay.
It's designed to disassemble and basically destroy traditional Highland culture. Highland men can't carry broadswords or dirks or pistols. You can't wear a kilt, you can't speak Gaelic. Bagpipes are outlawed because the British looked at bagpipes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, they look at bagpipes, Scottish bagpipes, as a weapon of war. And you won't see those things sort of come back into traditional Highland life until the latter part of the 18th century. That sword has a lot of history in and around it. Yeah. As we mentioned, Curtis, in comparison to an actual Highland sword, this sword is produced by the British in 1750 for Highland troops that are in British service, who literally enlist to come and serve in North America during the 7 Years' War. So if we look at this, you can see literally as well the differences. Look how much longer your sword is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's considerably longer. Given that you know, you're a descendant of Highlanders, I was wondering if you'd like to try to hold this sword. You've got your gloves on.
Yeah.
Put it up over your head for a minute, because that's how they come down with it.
You know, I can just imagine, you know, the men in these battles wielding this sword with musket fire inbound and the fever.
Oh, literally, yeah.
They would have to.
They are feeling rather feverish. This sword would have been used at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham.
Okay.
And the Highland charge at the Plains of Abraham is the last true Highland charge in history where Scottish troops, or Highlanders, I should say, use broadswords and attack an enemy. And again, that charge, when the Frasers charged the center of the French line, it's without an order. Right? They weren't ordered to do that. So this sword is literally steeped in history, just like your sword. So we have that sort of story coming full circle with the story of the Highlanders. Now this is the part of the program where there's sometimes an ask if someone would like to donate or loan a sword or an artifact to the museum. But given the strong family history of this and the fact that we don't want you to get in trouble with your mom and your two aunts, but we can't thank you enough on behalf of the museum and this program for bringing this in and sharing it. It's a really a rare sword for being on this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So it's great of you to come and bring it in and share with everybody today.
Yeah, no, thanks for all the information. It was a great experience to find out more.
Oh, that's good. Thanks again for coming, bud.
So I think what we'll do with the sword is, you know, I'm going to give it back to my mom and her sisters. It'll stay in the family, and it'll get passed down from generation to generation. That's something that we'll just probably keep in the family.
My name's Brenda Steele. I'm originally from Dominion in Cape Breton, and I now live in Dartmouth. I brought in a set of World War I bagpipes, which belonged to my grandfather.
When the Germans heard Michael McDougall's bagpipes, they knew they were in for a fight. Passed down through generations, this remarkable piece of World War I history came into the hands of McDougall's granddaughter, Brenda Steele. These bagpipes were the 25th Battalion's battle cry, through bloody combat zones like Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, all the way to their triumphant march into the Belgian city of Mons. Courageously facing down machine gun fire and artillery, the military pipers were a psychological battering ram, a force of nature in the Allies' favour, and that made them a target. Almost half of the 2,500 pipers who served in the Canadian and British armies were wounded or killed.
Well, Brenda, I see you've brought in a set of great Highland bagpipes. They appear to be made by Peter Henderson in Glasgow, Scotland in 1915. And one of the reasons why we know this is because here on the silver slide is a hallmark of the silversmith that created the caps, the ferrules, and the slides on all of the drones and so on. At the bottom here we have the airbag made of leather and covered with government 1A tartan, which was different than the tartan that the 25th Battalion wore. They wore the Mackenzie tartan. They have African blackwood stocks at the bottom, and the drones are made out of ebony. They're fitted in ivory. As I said, the ferrules, the slides, and the caps are 0.925 sterling silver. Well, they're extremely unique, being made by Peter Henderson and Company in Glasgow in 1915. They were one of only 3 sets of that quality that were made by that company 106 years ago. So it's really lucky that they've survived all this time in playable condition. This particular set was likely played during the Battle of Vimy Ridge at Passchendaele, and later on in the war to the entry into the city of Mons in 1918 by your grandfather. And I've looked into his service records, and he left Nova Scotia with the 25th Battalion on the 20th of May 1915, and he stayed with the battalion until they came home in 1919. And they have seen a lot of history that makes these bagpipes very, very valuable indeed. These things should be insured for at least $30,000 and probably double that 10 years from now. It's completely priceless in terms of historical values, and if they could speak, they would have one heck of a story to tell.
Yeah. Well, I just look at the pictures of him with his bagpipes in later years, and you can tell it was a very prideful thing for him.
The photograph that you brought along here shows the 25th Battalion pipe band, likely in late 1915 or early 1916, because they have the mascot, Robert the Bruce. It was a goat. He was purchased for £1 in Belgium shortly after the battalion arrived there. And although it wasn't a Highland battalion per se, every single Nova Scotia battalion, they all wanted to have a pipe band to pay homage to the Scottish heritage of Nova Scotia.
Absolutely.
In case of the bagpipes, they're not only musical instruments, but they're also thought to be instruments of war. For centuries, they have been thought of as an intricate part of the battle spirit of Highland regiments. Pointed out to me that this is your grandfather here, seated to the right of the pipe major, Jock Carson, whose pipes we also have here in the Army Museum. So it's quite amazing to me, over a century later, to see both of these gentlemen sitting side by side and have both sets of their pipes here in the institution. It's an amazing story.
It is.
We say here in the Army Museum that there are no accidents, so I guess this is another non-accident. Photograph, for example, of Michael McDougall that's on display here at the museum, sitting right beside him is none other than Jock Carson. So here they are, sitting side by side, and a century or more later, we have both sets of those pipes here on display at the museum, so you can't make this stuff up. It's a real piece of Nova Scotia history, Nova Scotia military history, of which your grandfather was a big part.
I know.
The 25th Battalion was one of 2 Nova Scotia infantry battalions that were not broken up for reinforcements when they went overseas during the First World War.
How many survived? I remember you mentioned that before.
Well, the 25th Battalion had over 2,000 casualties during the First World War. And when you consider that they started off with 1,000 men, they were replaced twice over by the end of the war. But your grandfather was there for the entire First World War as a piper with the 25th Battalion.
Crazy.
And that makes him a really important part of Nova Scotia's military history. It's a great thing that a family like yours comes together and are willing to bring this kind of an artifact in for us to take a look at today. It's an incredible story to have these pipes still in playable condition here 106 years later. So I'm hoping that the family will agree that we can actually exhibit these pipes here at the museum in the upcoming season.
My grandfather was born in this province. He played in the war, and I really think they should be here. Hopefully they will stay here forever, and it's a wonderful legacy for my grandfather.
Brenda, I know you and I have been talking a lot about these pipes, and now I want to thank you and your family for being willing to loan these magnificent set of great Highland bagpipes to the Army Museum so that we can put them on display and allow tens of thousands of people come through here every year to take a look at them and appreciate not only their intrinsic value, but most specifically their historic value. It's a very personal artifact, and I promise you, we'll take good care of them. And I'm hoping that they'll be the source of many family stories in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Lisa Buchanan and I'm from Shelburne, Nova Scotia. My dad and the crew of the Amherst would check boats that were taking on water or that had been damaged through war activity. And they weren't supposed to take anything from the boat, but he found this Bible and he stuffed it in his boot and brought it back to the ship with him and brought it home.
Recovered during World War II from the floating wreckage of an Allied ship, the original owner of this modest Bible is unknown. Now in the care of Lisa Buchanan, it is a stark reminder of the forgotten sailors lost during the Battle of the Atlantic to German U-boats. These menacing submarines wreaked havoc upon Allied convoys, sending thousands of souls adrift to dark ocean graves. This Bible holds a mystery about one of those men in the form of a poem and a woman's name.
We're here at the Army Museum with Lisa Buchanan, who is journeying from Shelburne County. Very generous of you to share these artifacts with us. The pieces you've brought in, they tell the story of your father's time on the high seas, as well as the role of the Royal Canadian Navy in the North Atlantic. I was wondering if you'd like to tell us just a little about this before we get into it. This Bible belonged to your father?
It did. He showed it to me one day and told me the story behind it. It was found on a ship that he and his crew had gone on to check for survivors. He found this Bible and tucked it in his boot and brought it back, and hence brought it back home.
It's amazing when we look at this, it gives us like a moment in time of a young Canadian sailor's experience during the Battle of the North Atlantic. Mm-hmm. We're familiar with the story of how the Canadian Navy, the Corvette Navy, will chase, hunt, and combat U-boats. But another big part of their service on the North Atlantic is rescuing survivors and also going on ships that are torpedoed and sinking. So that is every bit as dangerous sometimes as hunting U-boats, because those ships can sink quite quickly.
Kevin, with Phyllis's name in the bottom of this poem, is there a way to possibly find a relative that this would belong to?
It would depend on if, again, we knew which ship this came off of. Mm-hmm. If we had a date that when your dad recovered this, we could check the ship's log and to see what ships they might have encountered. Without that, I think the search for Phyllis might be a little onerous.
I'm sure it's like finding a needle in a haystack.
It would be, yeah. It would be like a big haystack and a very, very small needle.
Certainly would be nice to find.
Oh, it would be. It'd be a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. She didn't have to try to find somebody in the ship's company who had a wife or a fiance or a dear companion named Phyllis. Those avenues are closing all the more rapidly as that generation passes, but I admire her willingness to take that on and try to fill that story for sure. So here is his attestation papers that show us the date he enlisted, and he enlists for the duration of the war. And when we open up here, we can see here all these different listings, and these are directly related to bases that he's part of during his time. So again, we have these photographs as well of your dad here in Londonderry. Here he is here in St. John's, and we figured this might be up on Signal Hill.
He looks pretty comfortable there.
Yeah, and again, you'd be off the ship, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
St. John's was renowned for its hospitality and its warmth, we'll say.
Yes.
To serving members of the Canadian Navy. They all loved Newfoundland. Yeah. Here he is here in his normal work attire on board ship, and here he's taken his jumper off, but he's in his number ones. And he's also sporting a bit of arms from the ship's armory. But these would only be issued to personnel for very specific reasons. So if you were boarding a ship or something like that, a landing party. Mm-hmm. So this one here, I think he's literally kind of almost like hamming it up for the photograph,
I think
right?
So too.
Yeah, it's kind of his wide
Forever the ham,
his
yes.
wide or Gary Cooper shot with like a sidearm. Here I am. Yeah, all these stories and these photographs tell that story of the Amherst and your father's experience. So your father was a valued member of the ship's company on the Amherst.
He loved his time there. That's hard. It's hard to describe somebody who was your stepdad and try to imagine what they were like during the war. He didn't talk about the war. It was not a topic that he wished. The only thing he ever said was that being in the war was the best 5 years of his life.
At this point in the program, People are sometimes asked if they'd like to donate or like to loan something they've brought in that's part of the Army Museum story. Now this is the Royal Canadian Navy story. It doesn't fall into our mandate, so you're lucky. We're not going to try to do that today. Well, thanks again for bringing this in.
Thank you.
Okay. Her father picking that Bible up off a sinking ship, it puts us right in the Battle of the Atlantic. My father was a North Atlantic squadron sailor. Yeah, there's a direct link to my own family's history. So it's quite poignant, I find, all these stories are.
My plan is to take the Bible to the Barrington History Museum and see if I can find out a little bit more about the Bible. I've really enjoyed today's experience and talking with Kevin and sharing my dad's story.
My name's Rosalie Smith, and I live in Eagle Head right now, but I was born in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. I brought several items. One of them was my grandfather's communion set that he used during the Second World War, and a painting that was done of him by Captain Will Longstaff.
This communion set comforted soldiers who were going through hell on earth. Harry Hill used this set as an army chaplain in World War II. His granddaughter, Rosalie Smith, recently rediscovered it in a family attic. No amount of training can fully prepare troops for the terror and trauma of war. And so chaplains representing every religious belief have existed for as long as there have been armies. They administer the last rites to dying soldiers. They calm the wounded and scared, and they provide a safe place to confess sorrows, secrets, and sins. Armed only with faith, approximately 1,400 Canadian chaplains braved bullets and bombardment as they tended to the spirits of troops on beaches and battlefields across Europe, Africa, and Asia during the war.
Well, Rosalie, it's so nice that you came today and brought so many fascinating articles with you. So I know you found these items when going through your mother's attic. Mm-hmm. What did it feel like to find all of these treasures when you were up there in the attic?
I said it was just like an archaeological dig. Everything I opened, there was something else and something else. And there was not a lot of rhyme or reason as to how things were put away. So I was afraid to dispose of anything for fear that I would find something that went with it, which is exactly what happened with this.
And we're very glad that you unearthed them and brought them here today.
When I was going through some photographs, I come across a photograph of the painting of my grandfather, and it says, taken in Captain Will Longstaff's studio. I didn't realize how big a deal it was.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about the painting itself. Here is your grandfather, Honorary Captain Hill, him being painted in a service dress uniform, and here's wearing the shoulder flash of the 8th Army, which was, at that time, perhaps his unit was a part of. The painting itself is typical of those done, portraitures done, and others done by Will Longstaff, and the composition is striking in the use of color and in the realism of the face of your grandfather. Will Longstaff is a pretty famous Australian author. He served with the Australian Imperial Force during the First World War, rose to the rank of captain, and carried on with his artwork in between the wars. He had a studio in England, as you know, during the Second World War. And it's possible that your grandfather and Will were actually friends. It's hard for us to prove that today, but I'm thinking that that might have been the case.
When you talk about the Australian influence there, my grandfather had a brother. His name was Charlie. The children were split up as British home children. They went into an orphanage. My grandfather came to Nova Scotia, and Charlie went off to Australia, and he served in the army, and obviously they connected somewhere along the line.
Will Longstaff went on to paint a number of not only battlefield scenes, but two pretty important allegorical paintings. One that hangs in the Australian War Memorial called Men in Gate at Midnight, and it shows the ghosts of the soldiers on the fields of Flanders rising up and marching towards the Men in Gate in Ypres. In 1931, he did another massive painting called The Ghosts of Vimy Ridge, and both are nationally significant to Canada and Australia. And as a result of that, Will Longstaff's reputation as a war artist is significant. Here on the right is part of the communion set that your grandfather used overseas during the Second World War. We have the chalice. We still have some 75-year-old communion wafers in there. The chaplain's branch was a very, very important part of a soldier's life. The death and destruction and the personal needs of those soldiers, oftentimes they looked at the chaplains as almost father figures. One can only imagine the fear and the trepidation of the young soldiers who were facing death. And one of the folks that really helped them through those times were people exactly like your grandfather, who listened to them, who gave them a sense that somebody cared about them. And I think that the role of the chaplain has been underestimated by many over the years, but they were very, very important to the soldier.
That communion set I had never seen until we found it in the attic. When I opened it up, I went, oh my. And then I realized it was what he had used on the battlefield, or at least in service.
I think when you're in a circumstance of great danger and where you could lose your life, in the next minute or two, humans need something to help them cope. And chaplains and religion, I believe, did help them cope, because chaplains had no formal rank. They were not in the chain of command. And so whatever the soldier would tell the chaplain stayed between that soldier and the chaplain. Rosalie, one of the things that we do here at the Army Museum is to preserve the personal military histories of many Nova Scotia soldiers. And we do that through our medals group collection. And so I'm wondering whether or not your family would be willing to donate your grandfather's medals when the time comes to the Army Museum.
I think our family would be honored to have that done.
Well, that's very kind of you for saying that. And we very much look forward to the day when we can include your grandfather's medals in our medals collection display. I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing the stories of your grandfather and his significant service throughout his life.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I'll certainly appreciate the fact that they're more significant than what I thought they were, and look at a place for them to find a good home so that others can appreciate them as well. I don't see the point in putting this stuff away and hiding it. We need to preserve what has gone on before us.
It's great to be able to see families who are interested in what their fathers or grandfathers did. More and more of them are wondering, what is going to happen to all of these pieces of my family's history when I'm gone? What is going to happen to this legacy? That's why institutions like the Army Museum, I think, are pretty important, where we're able to help the family preserve that legacy in a way that informs future generations.